Just as I said, that it's a lovely afternoon in Toronto this afternoon, and I'm not sure which time zone you're in and who's joining me today, so please let me know in the comments. Let me know if you have little ones or not so little ones joining. I'm going to be talking about The Garden of Peace today, which is a picture book, but I want you to know that picture books are actually for everyone. They're not just for little ones, so I'd love it if we have a real variety of people joining us this afternoon. So please let me know in the comments if you can hear me and if you can actually see me now. I'd really appreciate that. Let me know if my voice is clearer now. I see a few comments saying please speak a little louder, so I hope that's better. Okay, so I'm hearing still a little bit louder, so maybe you can just make sure that it's at the loudest. Okay, thank you, Harpreet. So you have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old joining us. We have Nihal Singh joining us. We have grade 6 and 7 here. Amazing. That's great to see. I used to teach grade 6 and 7, so those are students I know that love thinking deeply about books as well. So thank you for joining us. So Hirlan Soba, beautiful names. Thank you for joining us. So I hope many of you have gathered right now, and I want to begin so that I'm not taking too much of everybody's time. Thank you for joining again this afternoon. Welcome to Sikh Coalition's Kid Corner. If you've joined in the last few Wednesdays, you know that this segment is to bring lots of different creators together to share all of their different artistic creations with you. Today I'm really fortunate to have been invited. If you're joining for the first time, the Sikh Coalition's Kid Corner is a weekly virtual learning event where they have different creators. And today, my name is Navjot Kaur, and I am the founder of Saffron Press and also the author of 3 different children's picture books, one of which is The Garden of Peace. Now, this book I originally wrote as an inspiration story. My son really wanted to know why we celebrate Vaisakhi. And when I was looking and searching for resources, excuse me, there were very few resources that I felt resonated with him and our family, and in a way that I could explain it, that connected to the real world and would ensure that he had the values, the core values that I want him to grow up having as a citizen and a global citizen of change. So today's segment, I really want you to think about that. I want you to think about how do we become citizens of change. Now that's for everyone. We're living during a global pandemic right now, and that might be a little bit scary for some of you, and I understand that. Everything's changed, everything's a little bit different. We're having to stay at home, and we're learning at home. I know that can be pretty frustrating. I'm a teacher by profession, and I know that it's been hard doing that, so I can imagine how hard that's been for many, many people. And so we have to come together at times like this and figure out how we can support one another. So I want you to think again, what does it mean to be a citizen of change? Because that's something we're going to talk a lot about while we're reading this book. So this is The Garden of Peace. I want you to think just about the colors that I've used in this book, and you can see just from the cover. And when I turn the pages, when I begin reading the book, I want you to look at the colors, and I want you to wonder about where did those colors come from? Why might I have chosen those colors? And I want you to put the comments and questions in the box as we're reading. I'm going to be asking you lots of questions, so feel free to ask me questions. And if you are middle schoolers or high schoolers, I want you to really think about the literary device I'm using to write this story. I also want you to think about what kind of social justice issues am I talking about in this picture book. Because picture books can be used as a tool for change. They can be used to talk about those big ideas that we don't know how to talk about, or that are really difficult to talk about, or some of us just don't know how to talk about those things because they seem really touchy and difficult, and we don't even know how to begin that conversation. So I want you to think about those things as well while we're reading, and think about how does this story relate to what we're living through today, or maybe something that you've heard or read about. How does it relate to that? And then we'll keep going back to the idea of being citizens and change, and think about what that really means. So I hope many of you have gathered and are ready right now, and I hope you can see me okay and hear me okay, so do please let me know. I have a question already. It says, did you illustrate it and did you write it? So I'll be coming back to a lot of the publishing questions at the end. But I am the author. The illustrator is actually Nana Sakata, who's based in Australia, and she is of Japanese heritage. So you can imagine that we had to do a lot of talking and conversation about this book before she began doing any of the illustrations. One of the main things about Saffron Press is accurate, diverse representation. So that means that we need to do a lot of research before we write stories or illustrate stories, so that we're not promoting stereotypes or encouraging prejudice or bias against any people. We have to always ensure that we're telling the story that's true and factual and based on real research. Now, when I go into classrooms many times, I have children coming up to me, students coming up to me, especially students of color, and they say, I didn't know I could write stories. I didn't know I could become an author. So as you're listening today, I hope that you will take that message away, that you are able to write your own stories. You can write your story, you can illustrate your story, you can tell your story, because each one of us holds a story inside of us. And when we tell our own story, those are the best stories to tell. So if you want to, during this time while you're listening, you can start writing down little ideas that you think about while I'm speaking. And then you might take one of those tiny ideas at the end and say, okay, this is going to be the story that I write. And during stay at home, during quarantine, who knows? You might be ready to publish your first story. Okay, so we're going to go and start reading The Garden of Peace. Okay? And I'm going to switch, and we're going to actually start looking at the pages. Okay, so if we look at the first page here, you can see that I've used a very special color here, and I want you to keep that in mind and think about why might I have used this color at the very, very beginning. Now here's a little dedication. I wrote this for all the mighty girls and gentle warriors of change. We are stronger together. And here is the Garden of Peace. Hundreds of years ago, 5 seeds were sown in the garden of Anandpur, the city of happiness. Elders and little ones wondered if the seeds would ever grow. Few held out hope. A ruthless emperor was crushing dreams and replacing hope with a gloomy cloud of darkness. Where artists once flourished, now lay only crumbling sandstone remains. Bleary shadows loomed from the fog, eager to poke the cinders of misfortune. Little did the villagers know that trading weeds for lucky amulets would yield no greater fortune. The more weeds they cast aside, the weaker their own harvest became. And you can see how the illustrations show shadows. Shadows are usually the people who come to take advantage during really difficult situations. So I want you to think about what kind of people those shadows might represent. Plants that grew the highest shadowed vast fields, so none of the others felt the touch of the sun's rays. Weeds lying low struggled along with the crippled and blemished crops, grabbing onto any splashes of rainwater. Lush garlands grew higher and higher, while others ended up in a tangled heap. So I want you to think about what this illustration represents. You've got plants growing higher, and you've got weeds lying low, struggling. Who do you think they represent? Slowly, local rulers gave up their battles against the tyrant king, and from there on, it was settled. In exchange for their silence, Raja princes retreated to the safety of the hills, leaving their poorest subjects, water carriers, potters, barbers and makers, to rummage in whatever was left beneath. Hushed voices coaxed many to believe that these others brought bad luck. The weeds lying low were harboring disease, the rumors swirled. They could sprawl up to the hills and destroy their crops too. Any seeds found scattered in the heaps below were tossed into the darkest pits far, far away. So you've got the local rulers going to the safety of the hills, and you have everybody else left behind. Who do you think these people might be? A majestic barge would often fly close and swoop up these seeds. Where they would go, nobody yet knew. Until one tiny seed ended up in the garden of Anandpur with a handful of others. Somehow transplanted to the city of happiness, their journey was hardly over yet. Perhaps it was just beginning. The 5 seeds had weathered many storms. One was so covered in mud and grime that whispering clouds had named it the untouchable one. Other pods had shut tight like a turtle hiding beneath its shell. The emperor had heard the news, of course. He sent his men in disguise to follow the barge and destroy the seeds. Word soon spread across the land. Something extraordinary was about to take place in Anandpur. Villagers and townspeople hurried to catch a glimpse. Many laughed at the thought. A few were curious, but most truly hoped these seeds would sprout. And so, protected by splendid blankets of dense forests, with rustling lullabies to soften their fears, they continued along the treacherous path away from the emperor's thunder. I want you to think about this journey that everybody is taking. What kind of journey are they taking, and where are they hoping to get to? On and on they trudged, sheltered under the umbrella of drifting clouds and guided by the sandy red of the Satluj River flowing down from the Tibetan plateaus. Many more trekked the uneven path to arrive closer to the Himalayas and finally rest. The langar, a free kitchen, was open to all, and famished travelers rushed to fill their appetites. In the confusion, the ever-expanding crowd shared the earth to sit side by side another, never quite knowing whom the other might be. Now, if you are middle schoolers or high schoolers, you may understand what the other represents here. And if we think about the world we live in today, think about who the other represents in our world today. If you look at this illustration, there was a lot of work that went into figuring out the people who are sat in this illustration to ensure that we have gender equity. But we also are ensuring that we're thinking about colorism and who would have actually been present at that time. There was a lot of diversity going on during this time. Lively chatter was gaining force. Not wanting to attract unpopular attention, most announced the seeds too ugly and dried up to plant. Some already gathered, took one look at them, and threw them to the ground. But one very gentle soul wanted to give the seeds a chance. She was fondly known as Mother Love in the City of Happiness. The barge returned there with the seeds after flight. She cupped the 5 seeds in her bare hands to plant in the garden of Anandpur. It was the season of Visak, and the spring air would surely nudge them to grow. A healing breeze fanned the crowd. Hopeful travelers grew closer still, tending to the seeds one by one. Dea's family had left their village shop far behind. His giving hands nestled the first seed deep into the earth. And can you see what Dea plants? If you look clearly here, he plants kindness. Having tilled his own little plot of land, Dharam figured another handful of earth would give the next seed a fair chance. And you can see what Dharam plants. Himmat had spent his entire life amid the low-lying weeds. As he planted the untouchable one, the whispering clouds drifted far, far away. So think about where Himmat would have traveled from, where this little seed would have traveled from, and why he is planting the untouchable one. As a maker, foraging the earth was common for Mokum. Roots, weeds, fruits and bark, soaking, straining, dipping and stamping. His patterned hands were not going to let this little seed give up now. You can see what Mokum is planting here. One heart was beating like a drum in the crowd. From dawn to dusk, he'd gathered mounds of dead weeds along the same path. But today, Sahib left speckles of dust along a new trail as he planted the final seed. Now, if we look, think back, and think about all the seeds that have been planted, starting with their seed, we can see that we began with kindness. When you plant kindness, you start learning about what it means to be fair. And when you understand what it means to be kind and fair, because in today's world, it's not enough always just to be kind and fair. You need courage. Because some of the most difficult things we have to do, we cannot do unless we have courage. So kindness and fairness is important, but we also need to grow courage. And when we have courage, that helps us become determined. It helps us not give up, and even if people don't listen, it helps us raise our voice even louder. So we become really, really determined. And when we begin to have these amazing traits as part of who we are, then we can start becoming warriors of change. People in the crowd could not be certain at first, but the crisp mountainous air carried echoes of delight. The seeds were actually beginning to grow and sprout and bloom. The seeds were growing free thinkers, melody makers, poets and storytellers, dream chasers and warriors of change. This was the Garden of Peace. Now think about in today's world, think about the free thinkers, the melody makers, the poets and storytellers, the dream chasers, the warriors of change. Do you think we have these people in our world today, and who might they be? These 5 and all remaining travelers who had trekked great distances to see if the seeds would ever grow became known as the Khalsa. And a promise was made that day. They would share seedlings from the Garden of Peace and plant them alongside their local crops. The Khalsa promised to give each other a fair chance to grow, with the weeds, of course, because weeds were plants too, after all. And I want you to look at this map that's part of the story, and I want you to tell me what you notice. Tell me in the comments what you notice about this map. Tell me if you can see the seeds and where they might have come from. Think about which areas you can see. So all of this land is what we know today as India and Pakistan. But in the 1690s, this was just one piece of land. And so the 5 seeds came from all directions, north, east, south, west, and central. And there are very special monuments here too, and I wonder if you can guess what the monuments are and what they represent. Following that Baisakhi day in Anandpur, mighty girls took the royal name of Kaur. Gentle warriors were each named Singh. The Khalsa let their hair grow like the Garden of Peace and wrapped its beautiful coils under their very own magnificent crowns. As the majestic barge soared above, the people no longer cowered in fear. Hundreds of years ago, 5 seeds were sown in the garden of Anandpur, the city of happiness, and their journey was hardly over yet. It was just beginning. And at the end of this book, you will see that I've written an author's note, which goes into much more detail about the time of the 1690s and what was actually happening, and some of the historical reference behind the weeds and the plants growing highest and what was actually happening. And then you have your own little kind of a guide map to grow your own garden of peace. And you have all these ways to plant kindness through your words and actions. Be fair, even if it means walking a little bit further. It says an upstander needs to be courageous, because if you know what's happening is wrong, then you make it right. You believe in yourself because you can do it. And then you watch your spirit grow as a warrior of change. So the reason I included this at the back was to show children that all of you are able to become citizens of change. Now, right at the beginning, I asked you if you knew why I had chosen different colors. And if you look at the colors on this page, they pretty much show many of the colors that you've seen during the book. So during the research of this book, which was a lot, it took a lot of research to write this book, you can see that every single color was available in the 1690s. So these were pigments that came from plants and fruits. So they were all available at that time. So this book is actually illustrated in the colors that you would have seen at the time. And this is the story of the Garden of Peace. So I'm going to come back and see if there are some questions that I can answer for you. And I apologize for having to change things up a little bit today, and probably not... oh, you can't see me right now. Okay. Oh. I think there's a little bit of a lag. Okay, I think we're back. Okay. So one of the questions is, it's such a beautiful story. How did you get the idea to write this story? So the stories I write are usually stories that I personally connect with. So this was a story that I wrote because of the question, why do we celebrate Vaisakhi? Who are we? What does it mean to be a Sikh? And we know that these are questions that occur every single day, and those of us who are caregivers know that our children face these questions all the time. People don't know who we are. Even when we live in communities that represent us quite largely, there are still a lot of questions. So this book was really to not only try to give a different perspective to the word Sikh and to explain who we are and to explain Vaisakhi, but it was also to really show that as citizens of change, we can make great changes in the world, whoever we are. Every child has the capacity to become a citizen of change, because we can all do a little something. Just like we've been doing right now during quarantine and staying at home, I'm sure every single one of us has done something to ensure that we're staying safe and we're helping our neighbours and families stay safe. So you've already been citizens of change. Okay, so where can I get this book? Hopefully there'll be some details at the end. You can go to saffronpress.com. That's the website, and you'll be able to find all the details for books, and you'll be able to actually get lots of details about publishing and writing on my blog there as well. So I did not actually do the illustrations. The illustrator was Nana Sakata, as I said at the beginning. She was wonderful to work with because she herself believed deeply in diverse representation, which was already a really good start. And then we did a lot of research. So this took almost 8 years for me to write. And that's because it required a lot of research. If we look at Anandpur Sahib today and we look at Anandgarh Fort from the 1690s, it was very different. And I wanted to ensure that the representation was accurate in the book, as accurate as I could present it. So not only were the colours accurate of the time, but I wanted to make sure that the buildings, the background, the locations were accurate too. So there was a lot of research that went into regions, the seeds, where would those seeds actually be found, and if you look closely at the seeds in the book, you'll be able to figure out what regions they actually come from. Okay, the sound got low, so I'm going to try and bring the camera a little bit closer. Where did the design for the pictures come from? So I kind of answered that with what I just spoke about as far as doing lots and lots of research. So the research was a huge part of this picture book. I wanted to make sure that the illustrator that worked with me was somebody who would really understand my vision for the book and understand why I would choose to go with watercolors and that soft landscape feel to this book, because it was a difficult time for the people who were living during that time. It was really tough. I mean, people were getting poorer and poorer. There was a caste system that people were living with where, you know, there was a tax being placed on everybody's head, and so people who were poor couldn't afford that, so they were becoming even poorer. The rich were becoming richer and going to the safety of the hills. So if you think about those kinds of social justice issues, you'll realize that those are many of the issues we still think about today. So the watercolors were definitely part of that whole idea of bringing a softness to the story, but also thinking about those really difficult issues. Yes, so I have 3 books so far. So I have The Garden of Peace that I just read to you, but I also have Dreams of Hope, which is a book that I wrote as a father telling his daughter a lullaby, but it's, again, it has a much deeper resonance in that story as well. We think about environmentalism, we're thinking about sustainability, we're thinking about what beauty represents. When we think about the world today, for girls, beauty sometimes is so surface. So this story is trying to go beyond that and really looking at nature and finding the parallels of what beauty really represents. And then my first book was A Lion's Mane, which really thought about the interconnectedness of all of us as citizens in the global world. So thank you for all your questions so far. I think we're out of time, but if you still have questions, I want you to feel free to email me, message me, and connect with me on social media. I'm on Instagram, and I'm also on my website, of course, so feel free to reach out if you have any more questions. I don't think we'll have time to answer any more here, but I'd like to thank you for joining me this afternoon. I'm sorry about the few glitches we had at the beginning. I hope that didn't deter you from the story or from the experience. I'd like to just say that next week you're going to be really fortunate to be spending some time with Vishwajit Singh, who is the Sikh Captain America, and he'll be doing a workshop for you to find your inner superhero. So that will be pretty amazing, and I know that there'll be lots to think about for that. So look for the details on the Sikh Coalition site, and you can get updates there as well. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this segment, and we'll see you again.